Well, hi, everybody. God bless you. Thank you. Appreciate your being here on this Sunday morning. And we're here in the Christmas season, so I wanted to do a Christmas themed teaching, and I want to talk about the shepherds. Um, One reason is I've recently learned something about them that I'm super excited about. And we'll get into that as the teaching develops. But let's just start in chapter 2, verse 1. And we're just going to read through. We'll get to the shepherds very quickly here. Now, it came to pass in those days, and this is the days when Mary is pregnant, based on Luke chapter 1. So it came to pass in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus to register all the inhabited world for taxation. This first registration took place while Quirinius was governing in Syria. Now, I'm not sure that the decree actually went out specifically, but it was during those days that it went out and continued to have effect. And so Quirinius is governing Syria, and everyone went to be registered, each to his own city. This is a limited use of everyone. This is the males of age who were making, money. This did not apply to women, children. Otherwise, you'd have women going to one city, their husbands going to another cities. That's just not the way the ancient registration and taxation worked. So, verse 4, Joseph went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, that's where he was living, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is called the city of David because David was born in Bethlehem. That was his city. So, since David was arguably the most famous person in the Old Testament, or certainly one of the most famous, the city was called the city of David, because he, Joseph, was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. By the way, when it says that Joseph went to the city of David, from Nazareth to Bethlehem, it's depending on the route you travel and the group you're traveling with, because people didn't travel without a group. That could be 4 to 6 days, something in that neighborhood. And Joseph and Mary would have walked. I know there's a common Christmas picture with Joseph walking, with the reins of a donkey, and Mary sitting on top of the donkey, but that is a made-up picture. Joseph and Mary at the birth of Christ couldn't even afford a lamb for Christ's sacrifice, and the childbirth sacrifice. So they certainly couldn't afford a donkey. And the ancient records that we now have indicate that poor people walked. That was as simple as it was. So Mary and Joseph made that journey by foot, quite a long journey. Verse 6, now it came to pass while they were there, and they'd probably been there a number of weeks, perhaps even a couple months, the days were fulfilled for her to give birth. And there's commentary on all this stuff in the REV too. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no space for them in the guest room. And one of the reasons I wanted to read this section was because of verse 7, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. Because if you have read the work that I've done in the commentary here, or listened to some of the teachings, she and Joseph would have been taken into a private home when they got to Bethlehem. That's where they would have been staying, and she would have given birth in the home. And she's of the lineage of David, and Joseph is in the lineage of David, and in that culture, which separated pretty greatly between men and women, when a woman was about to give birth, she would be surrounded by other women, she would be attended by the village midwife, and all the men would be kicked out. That's just, the birth of a child was not anything to do with men, and they were booted out. And of course, they would just hang out on the street, especially if the weather's warm, and they would be awaiting the news. Is it a boy or girl? And if the birth was a girl, then they would announce that the birth was a girl, and people would look at the father and say, well, maybe next time, or something like that. And the reason for that is the birth of a girl took wealth and power from the family. If you gave birth to a girl, you took care of her while she grew up, and when she was 12, 13, 14, maybe 15 even, then she married outside of the house. She left your home and went and strengthened somebody else's family where she could give birth and add to that family. And not only that, she took a dowry with her, because in the biblical culture at the time of Christ, it was the woman that gave a dowry to the man. So the woman cost you the strength of an increased family and also material wealth. Where if a boy was born, he was going to grow up, he was going to add his physical strength to the family, and he was going to get married. So there was an extra girl that was going to come into the family, and she would have kids. And so those kids would build up the family. So everybody was excited about the birth of a baby boy. Nobody was particularly excited about the birth of a baby girl, except probably the girls who were in the house giving with the birth. But in any case, as soon as it was announced that there was a baby boy born, then the group on the street would all of a sudden become a raucous party. And there would be blowing of trumpets, there would be beating of drums, there would be shouting, there would be singing, there would be quoting of psalms, there would be all these kind of things going on. And that's how the shepherds found the house. If you notice, as we will see, when the angels show up and tell the shepherds that the Christ child has been born, they don't say, let me give you a street address. They didn't need to, because you're walking into Bethlehem. There was probably only one baby boy born that night, so there's only one place where they're screaming and shouting and trumpets, and all you've got to do is follow the sound. So verse 8 then says, and there were shepherds in the same area, living out in the fields and keeping watch over their flock by night. Now, we need to dispel some myths about the shepherds. First of all, biblically and culturally, at the time of Christ in Israel, shepherds were trustworthy. It has kind of gone around Christian circles that shepherds were not trustworthy. I mean, God calls himself a shepherd. Psalm 23. I mean, look, is God going to say, I'm an untrustworthy person? By the way, I'm an untrustworthy guy. No. David is called a shepherd. Even Cyrus the Persian, Isaiah chapter 45:1, behold my shepherd whom I have chosen, Cyrus. So shepherds were trustworthy. Secondly, I know the Christmas song says certain poor shepherds in fields where they lay, but there's absolutely no evidence they were poor. Abraham was a shepherd. He was wealthy. Isaac was a shepherd. He was wealthy. Jacob was a shepherd. He was wealthy. There are plenty of wealthy shepherds in Israel. So there's no evidence these shepherds were poor. They may have not been the most prosperous people in the world, but they might have been. There's just no way to know. But to label them as poor shepherds is really a miscarriage of scriptural understanding. Another possibility, but personally, I don't feel it's likely, is that because I know that the fields around Bethlehem were perfect for shepherding, perfect for sheep. And so a number of the temple sheep that were being raised specifically for sacrifice in the temple, those sheep were being raised around Bethlehem. And so it's taught that these shepherds were raising temple sheep. They may have been. I personally doubt it. And the reason I personally doubt it is because, frankly, the whole temple complex was dishonest. You take those sacrifices, and if you had to buy a sheep, then you had to go to the money changers, because the Sadducees controlled the temple, and the Sadducees had set it up where, let's say you lived in Galilee and you were using Roman coins. Well, you can't buy a God's sheep with a Roman coin. You have to buy it with a special sanctified coin. So you had to take when you showed up in Jerusalem, you took your change to the money changers, and then you changed your common currency, whatever it was, Greek, Roman, Persian, could be Egyptian, could be ancient Assyrian. I mean, there's all kinds of currencies, but you had to change that for the special holy currency that you could buy sheep or sacrifices with. And of course, the money changers always got a cut. So the whole system was frankly demonic and dishonest and ungodly, and took advantage of people. And my gut feeling is that the shepherds, these shepherds weren't involved in that system. Although realistically, for just raising sheep to be sold to the temple, they might have been. So we just don't really know about that. The fact that it says then the shepherds were living out in their fields and keeping watch over their flock by night or at night, that tells you that it probably was a temperate time of year. Um, and because, Bethlehem, even if it snows or is super cold, it doesn't stay that way long. And most of the time, the shepherds would have sheepfolds. And if it's a really inclement cold night, then the shepherds would not stay out at night, and neither would the sheep. They would go into a fold where they could be protected, get out of the wind, that kind of thing. So this tends to indicate that this is a more temperate time of year, that they were out watch over their flocks at night. Verse 9, and the angel of the Lord suddenly stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were frightened with great fear. And let's unpack this a little bit. The angel of the Lord, he showed up to announce things to Joseph and other things. You know, we don't really. I mean, one of them could be Michael, could be Gabriel. Gabriel was the one who made the announcement to Zechariah. So there are other angels that would qualify here to be the angel of the Lord. And it says suddenly stood before them. It wouldn't be suddenly to the angels, but as far as the shepherds are concerned, you're out there at night and you got your little campfire, and then all of a sudden there's an angel standing there. And that's another thing. When angels appeared to people, remember, they want to be in intimate relationship with people. So when angels appeared to people, first of all, they're almost always on the ground. There's one record in Samuel and Chronicles where an angel appears to David and he's floating in the air, but that's incredibly rare. I mean, if you think about, well, you just go through the scripture. When the angels appeared to Abraham, they were walking. They actually sat outside his tent and ate his food. And in Genesis chapter 19, the angels go walking into Lot. Lot doesn't even know they're angels, invites them into the house for food and protection. When the angel appeared to Gideon, Gideon didn't know it was an angel at all. He thought it was a man of God talking to him. Samson's mom and dad thought the same thing. The angel gave a message to Samson's mom. She goes running to her husband and says, "A man of God came to me." So when the angels appeared, they looked like people. And when it says the angel of the Lord stood before them, it's not like he stood 20 yards away and said, "Hi over there." I mean, if you think about what's a comfort range for you, if you're sitting in a house and an angel of the Lord showed up, he's not going to show up in the other room and kind of shout around the wall. He's going to show up right in front of you and talk to you. And that's what happened here. The angel of the Lord, all of a sudden, and he's right there with them. So that's one thing. The angels show up, but then it says, the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were frightened with great fear. Well, yeah, between the angel and the huge bright light, then I can see where they were frightened. Now, the glory of the Lord shone around them is something that I've just literally recently, just this year, 2024, have come to appreciate, because I always knew that was some bright, brilliant light, but I hadn't put the whole picture together. In fact, this is one of the things about research is it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You're looking for this piece and you finally found that piece, and then it's like, oh, then I know what this piece is. And when it was in my study of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel uses the glory of Yahweh phrase. And by the way, there's a specific phrase in the Old Testament that reflects this, and it's the glory of Yahweh. And the glory of Yahweh is a bright cloud that surrounds Yahweh so that you can't see him. But the bright cloud indicates the presence of Yahweh. We'll see that in a couple seconds. But so and really, I need to do a complete teaching on that, because a complete teaching on just that one fact would take every bit of this morning and maybe even a little more. We'll take a look at some verses, but this just touched my heart so deeply, because when I realized that the phrase, the glory of Yahweh, indicated the very presence of Yahweh, that I realized Yahweh showed up at the birth of his son. It just, Yahweh didn't depict himself as just kind of hanging out in heaven while down here his own son is being born. That the presence of Yahweh was right there. God wanted to participate in the birth of his son, and he did so through letting us know that the glory of Yahweh shone around them. So let's take a look at this. The first use of this phrase, the glory of Yahweh, is in Exodus chapter 16, verse 7. And it's interesting in the contexts, especially in the wilderness wandering contexts, in which this phrase shows up, because generally speaking, God's presence is inside the tabernacle and people don't really see it. But then as the people begin to murmur about what their circumstances and murmur against Moses, and all of a sudden it looks like things could get really dicey, perhaps really dangerous for Moses. All of a sudden, the glory of Yahweh, this brilliant cloud with God's presence in it, shows up. So the children of Israel, Exodus 16, are murmuring against Moses about what they have to eat. What else is new? Murmur, murmur, murmur. And so in Exodus chapter 16, verse 7, verse 6, Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, in the evening you will know that Yahweh has brought you out from the land of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of Yahweh. That's the first usage, because he hears your murmurings against Yahweh. And who are we that you murmur against us? So we go down to verse 10. And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of Yahweh appeared in the cloud. Now the cloud was regularly there, it was leading them. There was a pillar of fire by night, a pillar of cloud by day. But now the pillar of cloud materially changes. And it materially changes to such a degree that they say, whoa, we see the glory of Yahweh in the cloud. What's going on there? God's presence is manifesting itself in the cloud. And the cloud of glory, you've got to understand. Remember, there's a verse that talks about God dwelling in brilliant light, that God is so bright naturally that he's surrounded by this cloud of light that then both manifests his power and glory and expresses it, and also veils his personal image, which sometimes he lets people pierce. Like we read in Exodus 24, that Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up. They went up into the cloud and they saw the God of Israel. And that's all explained in Exodus chapter 24. Or Isaiah, when he's looking up in Isaiah chapter 6, and the glory, the brightness is pulled back and he sees God sitting on his throne. Or in Ezekiel chapter 1, and we'll be there. So let's look at some other scriptures. So we see this, that God shows up when Moses is threatened. Same thing happened. We don't need to go there, but just to show you, these verses are in the commentary. Numbers 14:10, Israel was going to stone Moses. The glory of Yahweh shows up. In Numbers 16:9 and 19, in Korah's rebellion, again, there's a rebellion against Moses, and the glory of Yahweh shows up. In 1642, when Israelite people died and the people were upset with Moses, Yahweh's glory shows up. He's always showing up when Moses needs him to protect his life. In Numbers chapter 20, verse 6, then Israel was upset with Moses about water, and Yahweh shows up in his glory, and that kind of thing. In Exodus chapter 40, verse 34 to 35, a record you guys are probably familiar with on some level, the glory of when Moses completes the tabernacle, it says the glory of God fills, the glory of Yahweh as the Hebrew text, the glory of Yahweh fills the tabernacle, and the priests can't even minister there because of the brightness of the glory. And we don't need to go there because we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 8. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 8, and we're going to do the temple. And what I want to show you here in 1 Kings chapter 8 is the parallel between the King's record and the Chronicles record, because this becomes very, very important. So in 1 Kings chapter 8, if we go to verse 10, it's talking about what happened at the dedication of the temple. At the dedication of the temple, Solomon's temple, obviously like Yahweh had done at the dedication of the tabernacle, Yahweh shows up. But how he shows up is described two different ways. So in Kings, it's very specific that he shows up in a cloud, where in Chronicles, it just says his glory was there. And it's in comparing the two records that we can see that the two terms are used synonymously, that the glory of God is the brilliance surrounding God's presence. And so if God's gone, there is no glory. It's just like there's the regular old cloud, pillar of cloud that appears, outside the camp of Israel. But when God's in it, then they see the glory of God in the cloud. They see an extra brilliance and know that God's presence is there. So in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10, it says, and when the priests had come out of the holy place, and that's obviously they'd come out of the temple area, the cloud filled the house of Yahweh. The house of Yahweh is the temple. So the priests come out and the cloud filled the house of Yahweh. Now, what is the cloud? Verse 11, so that the priests were not able to stand up to minister because of the cloud. Why? For the glory of Yahweh filled the house of Yahweh. So it's this cloud around him. And Solomon said, verse 12, Yahweh has said he would dwell in a thick cloud. So, so basically, yes, so Yahweh's presence is in this cloud. And see, I understood this from teaching the Old Testament, but I never put it together so tightly as to recognize that this was what God did at the birth of Christ, that he just so loved his son. He's like, I am not going to miss this. And he shows up in his personal presence in this cloud for the angels. So let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 1. Now we'll see the contrast here between Kings and Chronicles, because Kings describes it as a cloud. Interestingly enough, 2 Chronicles never even mentions a cloud. Let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 7. So in verse 1 of 2 Chronicles 7, it says, now when Solomon had finished praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of Yahweh filled the house. King said, the cloud did. Verse 2, the priests could not enter into the house of Yahweh because the glory of Yahweh filled the house of Yahweh. There we have again, the glory of Yahweh filled the house. King says, the cloud did, the glory did, mentioned them both. So verse 3, all the children of Israel looked on when the fire came down and the glory of Yahweh was upon the house. And they kneeled down with their faces to the ground. So by coordinating situations like 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 7, we can see that the glory of Yahweh is also used for the cloud. Now let's go to Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, I have, and I meant to do this, and so Rob, you might be able to help me out. I did a teaching on Ezekiel chapter 1 a couple years ago, where I explained that. I've learned some things since then, and there's really good commentary on Ezekiel 1, particularly verse 4 and verse 28, that could walk you through this whole thing. It's the type of thing that you're going to want to do over a couple hours. It's not a 15-minute study. this is stuff that I've been studying for years. But if you're in one of those situations where you say, I've got next Saturday free, I'm just going to take Saturday morning and I'm going to study this whole presence of God thing. I think you'd be really super blessed. It's really helpful to do that. But in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4 says, I looked and behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with fire flashing back and forth, and a brightness all around it. And out of the center of it gleamed something like the glow of gleaming amber out of the midst of the fire. So Ezekiel looks up and here's this cloud coming. And there's storms in the area of Nippur, approximately where Ezekiel lived in Babylon. There's plenty of storms, and there's enough dust that you could have but this cloud is like, holy smokes, this cloud looks a lot different. It's got lightning inside of it, and it's coming right at me. and this turns, as you read through Ezekiel chapter 1, then you find out that this quote cloud was God's chariot throne, and God is riding on a throne on top of a platform borne by cherubim. And so it's literally a chariot throne, and it's coming right at Ezekiel, and then it stops in front of Ezekiel, and God starts to talk to him. And Ezekiel's trying to describe this in verse 27, and I saw, and he's describing what he's seeing. In verse 28, he says, like the appearance of the rainbow that's in the cloud in a day of rain, brilliant, shiny, and perhaps multicolored, so was the appearance of the brightness all around him. So there's this great brightness surrounding God, but God had peeled that back a little bit, if you read the preceding verses, to show that it was really God on his throne. And this was the appearance of the form, which is actually kind of a lack of form. It's kind of like the form that a cloud has. It's sort of blurred on the edges. This was the appearance of the form of the glory of Yahweh. So Yahweh's presence inside this cloud is also described as his glory. We'll do just a couple more of these. Ezekiel, we're in Ezekiel 1, go to Ezekiel 3. But I just want to make sure this is cemented for you. And because God then gets described as his glory, and this is a good example of that. Verse 23, verse 22 says, the hand of Yahweh was on me. Verse 23, then I arose and went out into the plain, and behold, the glory of Yahweh stood there. It stood there in the sense that it wasn't moving, but also it stood there in the sense that Yahweh was inside that glory. In Ezekiel 3, 23, 24. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 4. And there's a lot about the glory of Yahweh in Ezekiel chapter 10. In Ezekiel, this is the last verse we'll read in Ezekiel. And Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 4 says, and the glory, so Yahweh here, as you read Ezekiel 10, 1 through 10, then Yahweh's sitting on a throne on top of a platform that's being carried around by cherubim. The cherubim are the motor, if you will, for this platform traveling throne, and Yahweh's on it. So verse 3 says, now the cherubim stood on the south side of the house. They're on the south side of the temple when the man went in, and the cloud filled the inner courtyard. So now what's happening is the cherubim chariot thrones on the south side of the temple, but God in his surrounded by his brilliant cloud fills now the inner courtyard. And then verse 4, the glory of Yahweh rose up from the cherub to the threshold of the temple. And the temple was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of Yahweh. So here we see Yahweh himself moves into the temple courtyards, and then the courtyards are filled with the brightness of his glory. So if we can put that together, now let's go to the transfiguration. Let's go to Matthew chapter 7. Because I think we all know that God was personally present at the transfiguration. I said 17. I'm sorry. I said 7. I meant 17. Matthew chapter 17 is the transfiguration. So here's Jesus with Peter, James, and John on the top of the mountain, and then they see a vision. Verse 3, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. We learned from Luke that they're talking about Jesus's death and what he's got to go through to die for the sins of people. Peter is out of his mind. It's like, oh my gosh, we'll build tents here for you guys. It just and verse 5, well, Peter's kind of lost his mind and is just speaking. Behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud. And why is the voice coming out of the cloud? It's coming out of the cloud because God's presence is in the cloud. So God shows up at the transfiguration. That this stuff is becoming so deep for me because, we're talking about Jesus Christ having to overcome everything mentally inside him. It was saying, I don't want to be tortured to death. I don't want to be crucified. And Moses and Elijah in her vision are there, and they're talking to him and encouraging him in that vision. And then God shows up at that time. And I think, wow, anybody that thinks that God isn't involved in what's going down here on earth, this is really cool stuff. So if we get this, then by the time we meander back this circuitous route and we go back to Luke chapter 2, when it says, verse 9, the angel of the Lord suddenly stood before him, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. I don't know whether the shepherds knew enough to realize that the glory indicated God's presence. I assume they did, because it's pretty clear in the wilderness wanderings, Exodus through Deuteronomy. It's pretty clear in Ezekiel. It's pretty clear in Kings and Chronicles and that kind of thing. So they may have been like, oh my gosh, it's bad enough that an angel shows up. Here's God just showed up, and you could see that would, in any case, whatever they knew or did not know, they were frightened with great fear. Love what the angel said, verse 10. The angel said, do not be afraid. And that's something that the angels say over and over again. We see this, meeting God face to face, or meeting a representative of God like a powerful angel face to face, can be frightening. So when God shows up to Abraham, Genesis 15:1, he said, don't be afraid. When the angel showed up to Gideon in Judges 6, don't be afraid. In Luke chapter 1, when the angel showed up to Zechariah, who was offering incense in the temple, he said, don't be afraid. And I like in Luke 1:30, when the angel showed up to Mary, and we've got to contextualize that properly because Mary was inside a house. I mean, here she is, a young single woman, and she's inside a house, and a strange guy just walks in. And it's like, hello, Mary. And it says she was, and she would have been startled. And so the angel said to Mary, do not be afraid. So this is a very common thing. So it makes perfect sense. The angel, would say, do not be afraid. For listen, I bring you good news that will cause great joy, which will be for all the people. And in this context, and there's good scholastic evidence for this, the people is the people of Israel. The Israelites called themselves the people. And that's pretty much through the Old Testament and through the Gospels, and even occurs in the Pauline epistles some, that in this case, why it's good news to all the people, all the Jewish people, because they had been looking for the Messiah. And so he says this, I'm going to bring you good news that'll cause great joy. You Jews have been looking for the Messiah for a long time. I'm bringing you good news, and it'll be good news for all you guys. Why? Verse 11, for to you was born this day in the city of David the Savior, who was the Messiah and Lord. And the angel has to use different descriptors for this, because you couldn't just say the Savior, because there were different Saviors in the Old Testament. You couldn't just say the Messiah or the Anointed One, because there were different anointed ones. You had to kind of put the whole package together. Verse 11 gives us another key. For it says, "For to you was born this day." Biblically, daytime, the new day started at sunset. So this tells you that Jesus Christ, if he was born this day, then he was born after sunset. Now, verse 8 said the shepherds were in their fields by night. We don't know how deep into the night it was. Could have been midnight, could have been 2 in the morning. It didn't really matter. They're out there at night. The angel appears and says there was born this day, which tells you that the birth of Christ happened that day after sunset. And they describe him as the Savior, the Messiah, the Lord, and the angels got the message. There may have been more that was said, but the angels got the message. And they said, verse 12, "And this will be the sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger." And again, that's all the angel had to say. He had said that the birth occurred in the city of David. So they would go, and actually it wasn't a city, it was a village. So the angels would go to the village, and there would be shouting and blowing of shofars and a big fire and hoopla and screaming. And so the angels would find, the shepherds would find that, and then to make absolutely sure that they got the right baby and that, yeah, this is for real. You'll find him in swaddling clothes. That was pretty common. Many babies of religious people were in swaddling clothes, but it would tell you that generally it would be within a few hours of the birth. But then lying in a manger, that's really strange because you would have to work really hard to clean out the manger. The manger was where you kept the animal food, and the animals were always slobbering into it and that kind of thing. So most babies simply weren't wrapped. I mean, weren't put in a manger. They just weren't. And I'm not really. All I can think of is that Mary and Joseph or Mary certainly was busy, and so they needed to keep Jesus Christ safe and out of the drafts and that kind of stuff. And so they wrapped him in swaddling clothes and they put him in a manger. But that, just for your knowledge, that would be unusual, that he would be in a manger. So the angels would come into Bethlehem, follow the shouting and blowing of trumpets, get to the house, walk in and see baby Jesus, and there he would be in a manger. They go, wow, that's something you don't see every day. And so that's what was going on with that. And then verse 13, and suddenly, I like, angels don't, it's not like, they just appear suddenly. It's like, in any case, verse 13, and suddenly there was with the angel, and that's important. It doesn't say in the air, the angel's on the ground. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly army, praising God and saying. So basically, if you've been on one of my Bible Lands tours and you know the area of Bethlehem, it's quite hilly, quite hilly. And so what you've got is the angel is talking, and then he says, Christ has been born. This is how you're going to find him. And all these other angels had probably been up in heaven lobbying God, can I go and be part of this? Can I go and be part of this? This is their savior too. One of their own was the guy we now call Satan. And most of these guys had been in serious combat, I guess, with demons, just like we see in Daniel, for generations, multiple generations. So they were super excited too about the birth of the Lord. So, they wanted to be part of it too. So can we go down to be part of this? And so all of a sudden, there's the whole multitude of the heavenly army praising God and saying, and by the way, another example of this, if you remember when with the record with Gehazi and Elijah or Elisha was surrounded by the Syrian army, and Elisha said, Lord, open the servant's eyes, and he sees the whole mountains around filled with chariots of fire. And that's basically what's going on here. All the mountains would have, army men on it, so to speak. That record was 2 Kings 6, verse 17. And then verse 14. And this is an important verse to understand. Glory in the highest heavens to God, and on earth peace among people with whom he is well pleased. And this verse has also been translated like it is in the King James, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. But that is not the best translation. Remember, the older translations, for the most part, did not have a handle on what we know today, both about the Greek language, the Greek text, and also the expression of the situation that Jesus Christ did not come the first time to please every person. He came to set forth God's standards and be a touchstone, if you will, for who is going to follow God and who is not. All we have to do is take a look around the Bible at a couple verses. I mean, I think about Isaiah chapter 11, verse 4 is a good one, but my gosh, there's so many of them. Again, this could be a whole teaching in itself. Then it's talking about the coming of the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 11, and in verse 4 it says, "But with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with equity for the oppressed of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the spirit from his lips he will kill the wicked." And there's so many verses about that. Isaiah chapter 63 is about Jesus Christ coming in the midst of the fight of Armageddon and how his garment is all splattered with blood, which is also in Revelation chapter 19, by the way. There's Isaiah 61 where God says, it's the acceptable day of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. So there are demon spirits and there are people that have made the lives of God's people miserable now for 6,000 years. In fact, if the only thing Jesus Christ's second coming did was get rid of evil people, in spite of all the pollution and thorns and thistles and whatever, if there were simply no evil people on earth, the world would be such a nicer place. It really would be, if that was all he did. And so so he's going to come and bring well pleased. And that's exactly right. And that's part of our hope, that Christ will bring peace to us, and that then in contrast, the wicked will be destroyed. In verse 15, back in Luke chapter 2, came to pass when the angels had departed from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go straight to Bethlehem." Gee, what a good idea. Let's go straight to Bethlehem and see this that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. Verse 16, and they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger. So there's the baby lying in the manger. That's exactly what they were supposed to see. This does, by the way, the fact that they were allowed to go in and see the baby tells you this had been a while, because, the women wouldn't let any men back into the house, into the residency, until they were sufficiently convinced that everybody was cleaned up and decent and there was order and stuff like that. So this could have been, a couple hours after the birth of Christ. So they went in and they saw the baby lying in the manger, verse 17, and after they saw it, they made known about the message that had been spoken to them about this child, because God had said, that this message, it was good news for all the people, and it will cause great joy. So in that, I think the shepherds got the idea that, and rightly so, they correctly absorbed the idea that they were supposed to be the first messengers, the first evangelists. And what an interesting tale they've got, because when it says, after that they made known about the message that had been spoken to them about the child, they're bringing a brand new revelation to the situation, because Joseph and Mary show up in Bethlehem. She's pregnant. What are the chances that she told people, by the way, we haven't had sex yet. This is really the promised Messiah, even though, so I don't think that would have happened. because if you've done any study in Isaiah chapter 11, I know the King James Version and some other versions say the virgin shall be with child, but the actual Hebrew text reads the Alma, the young woman, will be with child. And so the Jews were not expecting a virgin birth. Joseph certainly wasn't, and an angel had to say that which is in her is of the Holy Spirit. Mary wasn't. She said, "How will this be?" So there was this idea that there was this prophecy sitting out there that there would be a virgin birth is not correct. The Matthew, we understand it was a virgin birth, and so Matthew reads back into Isaiah chapter 7 that this was about a virgin birth, but actually it's the angels. And I can imagine the guys are all on the street, and the angels say, "This is the promised Messiah," and they're all like, "Really? How did you know this?" You know, and so it was the message of the angel that really got the news out that this was the promised Messiah. There's no indication that Joseph and Mary had started talking about that, and probably likely because very few people would have believed him and it just would have caused problems. But anyway, so they then went and made it known about the message that was spoken, which is, "This is the promised Messiah," verse 18. And all who heard it were amazed at the things that were told to them by the shepherds, which is really true. Verse 19, but Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in their heart. And eventually, verse 20, the shepherds returned because they had sheep to take care of, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen. Everything was just as it had been spoken to them. And I'll close with one more thing that I think is important about the shepherds. That when Christ was claiming to be the Messiah, as he started his ministry 30 years later, or about 30 years later, notice that there's no indication at any time that he or his apostles or the religious leaders said, "Well, we're going to go find those shepherds and ask them if they really saw this angel thing and if they were really told this was the promised Messiah." And there's a 30-year gap between what the angels told these shepherds and when Jesus Christ started his ministry. And my bet is that during those 30 years, these shepherds passed away. So God gave them a job to do, and they did it. He said, "Go make this known." And they went and made it known. And I don't think they ever saw the real fulfillment. They never saw Christ's resurrected body. They never really had the chance to believe that he had been crucified and died for their sins and then was raised from the dead. You know, that and that's how we've all got to feel. God gives us an assignment. You are who you are. You have the ministry that you have. You have the service to God that you have. And our job is to do that service faithfully. Do that service faithfully. And then and we will be blessed for it. It doesn't mean we're going to see all of the fruit of the work that we do. You know, and these shepherds certainly didn't. Or it seems that they didn't anyway. But they were blessed to be able to do what they could do. So these were trustworthy, great, wonderful men that God announced to the world that, by the way, that baby is not the result of fornication. That baby is my child, the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the Son of David, through whom you and I have everlasting life. So thank you for your attention this morning. It's been wonderful to be here and get to share this. So a great message. So thank you so much.